Dr. Formwalt, if he would come forward. We're running a little early, which is fine. He's written the book, the copies of which are available in the gift shop if you'd like to buy one. I checked Amazon, they do not have it, so they're out. So if you need one, you need to get it here. So if you'll come.
All right, I've entitled this presentation, The Southwest Georgia Civil Rights Movement and Historical Interpretation. This is what historians do, we interpret, and that's why every generation has to rewrite the past, because they can see the past through different eyes and maybe see things that we in this generation can't see. Now, as the charade stated earlier this morning, for many people with a passing knowledge of the civil rights movement, the term Albany Movement means failure. When I moved to Albany 37 years ago, I was a young, newly minted PhD in early American history, grateful to land a temporary one-year position at Albany State College. Before I applied for the job, I had never heard of Albany, Georgia, and did not know that Albany State College was a historically black institution. As for the Albany Movement, when Albany Police Chief Laurie Pritchett and his men were arresting 750 civil rights protesters, mostly local African Americans, in this dark corner of the Deep South the second week of December 1961, I was anxiously anticipating my 12th birthday, so I was out of diapers by that time, in my native Massachusetts, completely unaware of the unsettling developments of going on in Southwest Georgia. Newly arrived in the Deep South in 1977, this student of the early Republic in the Old South saw the modern civil rights movement as practically current events. And I was not far off the mark when you consider that as late as 1976, restrooms in the local courthouse were locked and only white employees had the keys. Historians had only recently begun writing the history of the movement at that time. Those writing in the 1970s and 1980s about the Albany movement portrayed it as part of a bigger national story, often told in terms of the life of Martin Luther King, Jr. For example, the biographies by David Levering Lewis, David J. Garrow, and Taylor Branch, and also the PBS series, Eyes on the Prize. They all tell it from that King-centric perspective. As a result, Albany's significance was shaped by the role that it played in King's career. The story begins just weeks before King's arrival in Albany in December 1961 and ends with his departure at the end of the following summer. This kind of reminds me of the movie Selma, which I saw last month, which apparently a number of people in this room have seen. The film is also King-centric and tells the story from his perspective. Now, I'm not suggesting that the movie is a terrible movie. I think it's a great movie. But lost in the perspective, or lost in the story, is the story of local organizing before King came and after the Selma to Montgomery March. Sound familiar? It's the same mistake many historians make with Albany. No one knows, for example, from watching this film, that Mrs. Amelia Boynton Robinson, the centenarian guest of President Obama at his State of the Union address last month, was one of several founders of the Dallas County Voters League, 3 decades before King came to Selma. Or that after King left Selma, SNCC and local organizers founded an independent local political party in nearby Lowndes County, which took as its logo the Black Panther. Yes, this was the original Black Panther Party. Another problem I had with the movie was this characterization of the Albany movement as, quote, pathetic, especially after King left in 1962. Another recent example of the King-centric Albany movement can be found in the recently published Volume 7 of the Martin Luther King Papers, covering January 1st, 1961 to August 31st, 1962. The very nature of this superb scholarly work, however, is limited to looking at the movement through King's eyes. It's an excellent account of King's involvement in Southwest Georgia, but the editors do not draw back and panoramically view the entire scope of the movement, examining its history before King arrived and after he left, and at the work of other movement leaders not under SCLC control. The King-centric approach to the Albany movement inevitably leads to a tale of failure. Albany remained as segregated in September 1962 as it had been the previous fall. King himself admitted that he had failed in Albany, but the redeeming factor was that the lessons he learned in Albany led to success the following year in Birmingham. Once King leaves Albany in 1962, the Southwest Georgia community disappears from the national accounts of the civil rights movement, and we are left with the implication that the movement had failed. The problem with this approach, as Shirley Sherrod pointed out this morning, is that the Albany movement did not begin with King's arrival in town, and it did not end when he left. In the early 1990s, a young British historian, Michael Chalfin, challenged the story of Albany as a failure by stretching its chronological limits back to the post-World War I period and forward to the 1970s. In my new book, Looking Back, Moving Forward, The Southwest Georgia Freedom Struggle, 1814 to 2014, I take the origins of the movement back through Reconstruction to the resistance of enslaved African Americans before the Civil War. Similarly, I trace the continuation of the freedom struggle into the 21st century. Another British historian, Stephen Tuck, expanded the geographical limits of the Albany movement to include much of Southwest Georgia. Although Albany remains center stage in Looking Back, Moving Forward, it shares that stage with the rest of Southwest Georgia, especially Lee, Terrell, Baker, and Sumter counties. Expanding the chronological and geographical boundaries of the Albany movement changes the story from one of failure in Albany in 1962 to one of a series of successes interspersed with setbacks that motivated more resistance to oppression. The story begins with the age-old American institutions of slavery and freedom walking hand in hand into Southwest Georgia after the land was taken from its Creek Indian inhabitants. Rich planters and investors, enslavers, bought the fertile land on the Southwest Georgia frontier, and the thousands of enslaved Africans and African Americans needed to grow the money crop of the day, cotton. Life in the slave labor camps, or plantations as we euphemistically refer to them as, of the region was brutal. Claiborne Gantling, an enslaved teenager in Terrell County during the Civil War, later recalled that every morning a horn was blown to wake the hands, all of whom had to be in the field working at sunrise or be tortured, that is, whipped with whips and leather straps. He remembered a woman who was beat until she could hardly get along. Such images of cruelty and barbarity were seared in the minds of enslaved Southwest Georgians and led some to resist by breaking tools, feigning illness, or running away. In fact, in the book, I argue that the runaway slaves were really the first freedom fighters in Southwest Georgia. In order to protect their lucrative labor system, Georgia enslavers took their state out of the Union. After 4 long years of civil war and 750,000 deaths, the war ended and with it slavery. When the federal troops arrived in Southwest Georgia 6 weeks after Appomattox and declared slavery was over, African Americans tested their freedom in many ways. Most important, they organized politically. When African American men could vote, they turned out by the hundreds in places like Albany, where they elected men of color to represent them in the state legislature as late as 1880. The thought of former slaves voting and being elected to office enraged many whites, and in 1868 alone, whites killed or attempted to kill 112 African Americans in Southwest Georgia. When several hundred African Americans walked to a political rally in Camilla in September 1868, they were attacked upon entering the courthouse square. A dozen marchers were killed and more than 30 wounded in what became known as the Camilla Massacre. With the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow era, Southwest Georgia freedmen faced an uncertain future. Violence and fraud limited their voting power in majority black counties. Yet African Americans built their own churches, schools, burial societies, and fraternal organizations. By 1880, African Americans comprised 85% of the population in Dougherty County, but whites had most of the political and economic power in the region. As African Americans continued to resist oppression in the late 19th century, white Southwest Georgians added a new weapon to their arsenal of violence and fraud: the law. The Jim Crow era is distinguished by the codification into state and local law of white control over black life. One of the earliest examples of this abuse of law to re-exert mastership was the establishment of convict leasing, in which the state basically rented out its expanding number of penitentiary prisoners, mostly black, to private contractors. Southwest Georgia planter Colonel Benjamin G. Lockett took advantage of this new way of exploiting black labor and established penitentiary camps on 3 plantations in Dougherty County. Life at the Lockett penitentiary camps was like slavery on steroids. Convicts were awakened by 3:30 in the morning to begin 12 to 15 hours at hard labor with lights out at 9 o'clock. A guard on Lockett's Rawls place, quote, saw the colored convicts whipped unmercifully with a strap by the whipping boss. Imagine, that's one guy's job, whipping boss. And on one occasion, he witnessed one colored convict whipped until his skin was perfectly raw. For 8 years, Benjamin Lockett ran these 3 hellholes, but abuse of prisoners continued long after he went out of business. During the Jim Crow era, African American men lost the vote, and more than 120 of them were brutally lynched in Southwest Georgia. I should point out that African American women never had the vote before Jim Crow, and that there were several cases of African American women being lynched as well. In the face of white terror, blacks continued to resist. Some boarded trains and headed north. Others organized divisions of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association in rural counties and NAACP branches in urban areas. In 1947, a group of black Albany letter carriers formed the Criterion Club, which created a local voters league to expand African American voting in Albany. When the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its momentous Brown versus Board of Education decision outlawing school segregation in 1954, Southwest Georgia whites responded with a demand for massive resistance to school desegregation. The mid-1950s appeared bleak for African Americans in Southwest Georgia. Massive resistance, the growth of the Ku Klux Klan, and the arch-segregationist voice of the new media king in Albany, James H. Gray, who controlled the major daily newspaper, a radio station, and the local television station. All of these made for a formidable Jim Crow alliance. Yet there were glimmers of hope. The eloquent voice of a new young African-American attorney, C.B. King, was heard in the white man's courtroom around Southwest Georgia. By 1958, within 10 years of its establishment, the local Voters League could point with pride to the registration of nearly a fifth of those blacks in Albany eligible to vote. Meanwhile, in what would become known as Terrible Terrell, NAACP organizer D.U. Pullum faced a white reign of terror in the late 1950s. As recently documented on the website of the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project at Emory University and by historian Stephen Tuck, white law officers in Terrell brutally attacked and in a half a dozen cases murdered African American men with impunity. But there was even a spark of hope in terrible Terrell. D.U. Pullum asked Korean War veteran Lucius Holloway to serve with him as vice president of the Terrell County branch of the NAACP. Holloway agreed, and together they recruited members. And in 1959, looking ahead to the important role that students would play in the movement, black businessman Thomas Chapman Sr. organized a local NAACP youth council in Albany. By the time SNCC operatives Charles Sherrod and Cordell Regan showed up in Albany in fall 1961, students at Albany State College had already organized and demonstrated their resistance to Jim Crow. And this is a story that Raquel Henry, my colleague, is going to be telling us about, there you are, right after I'm finished. Suffice it to say that the organizing and protest efforts of junior high, high school, and college students, led by SNCC, put pressure on community leaders to get more involved in what was clearly becoming a growing student movement in Albany. On November 17th, 1961, leaders of several black community organizations created a formal organization they named the Albany Movement and chose osteopath William G. Anderson as its president. 5 days later, on November 22nd, the day before Thanksgiving, 5 students were arrested and jailed for attempting to desegregate the Trailways bus station. The newly organized Albany Movement called for its first mass meeting the Saturday after Thanksgiving at Mount Zion Baptist Church. All 5 of the arrested students attended the mass meeting and spoke of their actions and their jail experiences. Freedom songs and spirituals punctuated the meeting, and singing soon became one of the hallmarks of the Southwest Georgia movement, as Deanna talked about earlier. Out of Albany emerged the SNCC Freedom Singers, including Albany natives Bernice Johnson Regan and Rutha Harris, who brought this rich musical tradition borrowed from the rural black Baptist churches to other communities around the nation. A high point of the 1961-1962 Albany movement was the 9 days in December 1961 that featured the arrest and eventual release of 750 people, including 8 Freedom Riders, most of the Albany movement leadership, and Martin Luther King Jr. When King arrived on December 15th, he did not create a movement, but joined one for which organized resistance was more than a century old. In the week before King arrived in Albany, nearly 500 protesters had been arrested and jailed for challenging Jim Crow. Another 1,000 were arrested in the next 18 months. King spoke at both Shiloh and Mount Zion Baptist churches the evening he arrived in Albany, and was arrested with 264 other protesters on a march to City Hall the next day. Convinced that city officials had agreed to certain concessions, King accepted bail 2 days later, only to discover that the white leadership refused to consider any of the movement's demands. King returned to Albany at the end of February for his trial, which the judge recessed before rendering a decision. King would be called back to Albany in July for his verdict and sentencing. In the meantime, however, Charles Sherrod looked to the future spread of the movement into rural Southwest Georgia and developed a radical plan in the spring of 1962. The key to changing society in the rural Black Belt was to enfranchise African Americans. If they had the vote, they could elect political leaders who could bring about change. But direct action protest, as in Albany, was not going to work in the heartland of white supremacy. The strategy for bringing about change in rural Southwest Georgia had to be community organizing. To challenge the rural white power structure was an enormous task. Sherrod proposed to start with the two closest counties to Albany and the ones that he already had some experience with, Lee and Terrell. African Americans comprised 60% of the population in the two counties, yet no more than 50 blacks were registered to vote in either of them. To work with and develop local African American leaders and to promote voter registration, Sherrod planned to send into these counties interracial teams of students. A number of people at the time might have considered such a plan insane. Yet Sherrod had a vision for a new world in Southwest Georgia, one in which black and white worked together. To strike at the root of segregation, he said, you must attack the idea of white supremacy. That is, that white is superior to black. Interracial student teams would show that blacks and whites could work together. There was also a pragmatic reason for using interracial teams. Sherrod knew that white students would attract more media attention and consequently more federal attention to the situation in Southwest Georgia. For many historians, the focus of the Southwest Georgia movement in 1962 has been on Martin Luther King's return to Albany that summer. At the same time, however, Charles Sherrod and his integrated troupe of SNCC workers and volunteers opened a second front in the war on Jim Crow in the nearby plantation counties of Terrell and Lee. Needless to say, King got most of the news coverage, but the rural campaign was equally important. King flew to Albany on July 10, 1962, to hear the verdict in his trial for parading without a permit in December of '61. He and Ralph Abernathy were found guilty and sentenced to 45 days in jail or a $178 fine. Although the pair chose jail, white attorney B.C. Gardner anonymously paid their fines, and they were released against their will on July 12th. King decided to stay and carry on his effort to desegregate the city. He brought in his Southern Christian Leadership Conference staff to coordinate the campaign. They worked in uneasy alliance with the SNCC staff, led by Sherrod, Regan, Charles Jones, and Executive Secretary James Foreman, who had come down from SNCC headquarters in Atlanta. The third element, ostensibly leading and holding together this restive coalition, was the Albany Movement organization led by Dr. William Anderson. To achieve its goals of direct talks with the City Commission and dismissal of the cases against the more than 800 protesters arrested since November, the Albany Movement resumed its protest marches to City Hall. It also expanded its efforts to desegregate public facilities and increased voter registration efforts. At nightly mass meetings, King, Anderson, and other movement leaders exhorted the hundreds of attendees, but only one march took place in the 10 days following King's conviction and jailing, resulting in 32 arrests. While many of these protesters languished in jail, SCLC and SNCC leaders taught daytime sessions on nonviolence at Mount Zion before sending out waves of students to desegregate the public library, parks, and pools. In the meantime, the city secured a federal court injunction against the movement and specific leaders, including King, preventing them from further protests. One movement leader not named in the restraining order was the Reverend Samuel B. Wells, an unpolished country preacher who led 161 demonstrators, mostly teenage girls, from Shiloh Baptist Church to City Hall on July 21st. They sang "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around," a freedom song introduced in Albany earlier that month by Ralph Abernathy. Improvising, they sang "Ain't Gonna Let No Injunction Turn Me Around." Downtown, Police Chief Laurie Pritchett arrested all 161 protesters, and many of whom were sent to jail in the outlying counties. And I should pause at this moment to talk about little book that I read recently by Sandra Webb. I forget the title of it. Beneath the Bars of Justice. Thank you, Sandra. Which is a fictionalized account of those 161 girls who were sent off to Camilla and other jails. She focuses on the Camilla experience, and I found it to be a really valuable way of conveying what it was like to be a teenage girl arrested in Albany at that time. Arrested and sent to Camilla, of all places. One of the central figures in the drama of the Albany Movement, Laurie Pritchett, has gone down in history as a Southern law officer who practiced nonviolence in dealing with civil rights demonstrators. He instructed his officers to handle protesters carefully without resorting to violence. Pritchett had studied Martin Luther King's Gandhian philosophy of nonviolence. King's strategy was to overwhelm the unjust system's jails by filling them with protesters, forcing the authorities to address their civil rights issues. Pritchett, however, made sure that there was always plenty of jail space. Later in life, he spoke with pride about how he had outfoxed King by renting jails from the sheriffs in the surrounding counties. There, out of the sight of the national news media, prisoners were abused and experienced the violence that Pritchett's own men in Albany avoided. The Albany police chief could not control all the law officials in the city, however. On July 28th, one of them, the 76-year-old sheriff of Dougherty County, Cull Campbell, infuriated by C.B. King's visit to check on a client, beat the African-American attorney with a cane as he was leaving the sheriff's office. The bloodied lawyer, it took 8 stitches to close his wounds, encountered newsmen as he was leaving the courthouse, and that particular act of violence was reported in the next day's New York Times. Campbell admitted that he had beaten King and told the FBI, "I told the son of a bitch to get out of my office, and he didn't get out." 5 days earlier, Albany activist Marion King, C.B. King's sister-in-law, was visiting Albany protesters jailed in Camilla when she was beaten by the Mitchell County Sheriff and Deputy Sheriff. She was pregnant at the time of the attack and later miscarried. Despite his moniker as the nonviolent police chief, Laurie Pritchett's action and inaction contributed to violence. In the end, it was not the philosophy of nonviolence that Laurie Pritchett followed, but it was the tactics of nonviolence that he so shrewdly employed. Albany Movement attorneys appealed the federal court injunction banning demonstrations and won a temporary suspension. Once again, King got himself arrested, and after 2 weeks he was let go. Others joined King in jail by either protesting at City Hall or the Carnegie Library or trying to integrate a restaurant. In all, 441 protesters were arrested in Albany in July and August. In response, Chief Pritchett closed the libraries and parks indefinitely in the interest of public safety. By the end of the summer of 1962, it was clear that King had proved ineffective in desegregating Albany. Although King himself felt he had failed in Albany, African Americans in Southwest Georgia knew that King's failure did not mean that the movement had failed. SNCC Field Secretary Charles Sherrod remarked that despite how Dr. King might have felt, as far as we were concerned, things moved on. We didn't skip one beat. As important as the Albany front was in the struggle against Jim Crow in 1962, the conflict on its second front in the neighboring counties of Terrell and Lee was equally significant. This second front was different in several ways from that of Albany. Not only were the outlying counties rural, the white supremacists there were more hostile, in fact murderous. Unlike the Albany Front, which was fought by a coalition of civil rights groups, only one group, SNCC, put troops on the ground in Lee and Terrell counties in 1962. And Laura, I'm reminded of a comment that Sherrod made to your brother, Jack, when they were driving out one night and crossed over into Lee County. And he said, this is where CORE and SCLC stop. It was SNCC territory from that point on. SNCC's Southwest Georgia project to increase African American voter registration was what had brought Sherrod and Cordell Regan to Albany in the fall of 1961. Sherrod thought of the Southwest Georgia project as a wheel. Work in the town of Albany was the hub, and organizing in the outlying counties of Lee, Terrell, and eventually Sumter were the spokes. Together, hub and spokes drove the wheel. Hence, college students who came to Southwest Georgia to work with SNCC found themselves attending a mass meeting in Shiloh one night and canvassing in Terrell County the next morning. In 1962, there were roughly a dozen SNCC workers in the Southwest Georgia project. When they arrived in Albany, SNCC workers learned the basics of community organizing. When they went into a community to increase voter registration, they held weekly meetings at local churches. At these meetings, they introduced the attendees to the voter registration effort, heard guest speakers, sang freedom songs, shared fellowship, and often mitigated fear. In addition, they held weekly citizenship classes where they taught people how to fill out and answer the questions on the voter registration form. SNCC workers canvassed door to door, talked to individuals one-on-one, gaining their trust and confidence, and they made return visits until they persuaded the often reluctant farm workers to come to the weekly meetings. SNCC workers, especially in Terrell and Lee counties, lived and worked with the constant and palpable fear of white supremacist violence. When asked in 1962 if he was afraid, Sherrod smiled and said, "Of course, all the time." Years later, Larry Rubin, another SNCC worker, told me that every day in Southwest Georgia, they were literally scared shitless. Even white reporters covering the movement admitted their fear of lawmen and other angry white men in rural Southwest Georgia. Simply canvassing for voter registration in Dawson, the Terrell County seat, could be life-threatening, as Ralph Allen learned when he was physically attacked twice in July by white men upset that he was there to, quote, show our niggers how to vote. Later that month in nearby Sasser, the Terrell and Sumter County sheriffs, several deputies and other lawmen, and a number of disturbed white citizens interrupted one of Sherrod's nighttime voter registration meetings in the Mount Olive Baptist Church. Besides Sherrod and Allen were Charles Jones, Penny Patch, Lucius Holloway, chair of the Terrell County Voter Registration Drive, 3 major newspaper reporters, and 35 African Americans from Terrell, Lee, and Dougherty counties. Terrell County Sheriff Z.T. Matthews told the group, "We want our colored people to go on living like they have for the last 100 years. He continued, "I tell you, Captain, we're a little fed up with this registration business." Determined to stop voter registration efforts in neighboring Lee County, white terrorists firebombed Shady Grove Baptist Church, a SNCC voter registration meeting place, on August 15th. At the end of the month, night riders went after 4 African Americans active in Lee County voter registration efforts and riddled their homes with bullets. Miraculously, no one was injured. The following week, Carolyn Daniels welcomed newcomer Jack Chatfield to her home in Dawson, where several other SNCC workers were staying. It was Jack's first night in Southwest Georgia. Night riders fired a series of shotgun blasts into the house, hitting Jack in the arm and grazing 2 other students. 4 days later, on September 9th, 2 more churches were firebombed, both in Terrell County. A week later, a 4th church, the I Hope Baptist Church near Dawson, was burned to the ground. People are scared. People are crying. Some say they're going to leave Terrell, said Sherrod, but SNCC won't be moved. He announced a voter registration meeting in Sasser in 2 days. The meeting would take place in a tent since the Mount Olive Baptist Church there had been destroyed. Despite the destruction of SNCC's voter registration meeting churches and night rider attacks on local voter registration activists' homes, the freedom fighters of Lee and Terrell counties persisted with firm resolve. This rural front expanded to Sumter and Baker counties in 1963 and 1965, led by integrated teams of SNCC workers helping black citizens register to vote. For many historians, the Albany Movement was a 1961 to 62 affair coinciding with Martin Luther King's presence in Southwest Georgia. A closer look at the post-1962 era suggests a continuation of the freedom struggle that has largely been ignored in historical accounts. In 1963 to 1966, the civil rights movement continued in Albany and Terrell and Lee counties and expanded to much of the rest of Southwest Georgia, especially towns like Americus, Moultrie, Bainbridge, Newton, and Cordele. Hundreds were involved in public protest marches, sit-ins, and voter registration efforts. Many were arrested and jailed. Albany was the hot spot in the early summer of 1963 when close to 300 were arrested. And yet, I dare you to find that in a traditional account of the Albany movement. Later in the summer, the focus shifted to Americus, where over 250 were jailed. Meanwhile, the federal government went on the offensive and attacked the Albany movement by indicting the Albany Nine, a group of movement leaders and activists. A key element of the freedom struggle in the 1960s was the voter registration campaigns in Dougherty, Lee, Terrell, and Sumter counties, and eventually all of Southwest Georgia. One way to increase voter registration was to offer African American voters black candidates to elect. Voter registration increased in Albany in the fall of 1962, for example, when Thomas Chapman ran for a seat on the city commission. In 1963, Albany Movement President Slater King ran for mayor. A record 11,500 Albanians cast ballots in the three-man race. King came in second with over 2,500 votes, losing to moderate segregationist James V. Davis. 6 months after Slater King lost the mayoral race in Albany, his brother C.B. King qualified for the Democratic nomination for the 2nd Congressional District, which covered 22 Southwest Georgia counties. Campaigning in this region could be a real challenge. King opened the campaign with an outdoor rally in Cuthbert in mid-April 1964, and the impact of the campaign on voter registration was immediate. 1 week in July saw the registration of over 1,200 African Americans in Southwest Georgia. Although C.B. King lost the election, he proved that African Americans could not only vote, they could run for Congress. The summer of C.B. King's congressional campaign also witnessed passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which, among other things, outlawed discrimination in public accommodations. Most businessmen in town begrudgingly adhered to the new law and served black and white customers. People testing public accommodations the next winter were pleased with compliance. One civil rights leader said compliance was probably greater in Albany than it was in Atlanta. In fall 1964, the Albany City Commission authorized Chief Pritchett to hire 6 African American policemen. For some people in Albany, the world was changing fast, but not fast enough for African Americans. Whites who had oppressed them all their lives did not miraculously change their attitudes towards people of color. Jim Crow may have legally died, but it lived on in the hearts and minds of white Albanians. For example, the black policemen whom Chief Pritchett hired and could work only in the African American neighborhoods. And the Dougherty County School Board resisted until the last minute a federal court order to integrate the senior class at Albany High School. School integration at this time followed the freedom of choice model. 6 brave African-American young women volunteered to be the first students of color at Albany High School. Their senior year was a living hell. They were assigned to separate classes to isolate them further. In the cafeteria, white students spat on them and refused to sit with them. So the 6 African Americans would sit at different tables, causing a white evacuation at each. The 6 girls persevered through the taunts of their white classmates, including Paula Dean, and graduated on schedule. Despite the 1954 Brown decision and the 1965 Voter Rights Act, schools remained basically segregated, and black voters found it impossible to elect African American city and county officials in at-large elections. It was only when local people of color went to court in county after county in southwest Georgia that they were able to bring the white power structure kicking and screaming into the modern world of equal rights and diversity. Individuals like Mary Young, Johnny Johnson, and Charles and Shirley Sherrod went to court to tear down the barriers to African American advancement. Mary Young successfully argued that at-large voting diluted the majority black vote in certain Albany wards and was therefore unconstitutional. The result was the election in 1975 of the first 2 blacks ever to the Albany City Commission. Johnny Johnson sued the city of Albany for racial discrimination against African American city employees and job applicants. Federal Judge Wilbur Owens found the arguments of Johnson's attorneys, C.B. King and Herbert E. Phipps, persuasive, and he issued a permanent injunction that lasted from 1976 to 1995, requiring the city to increase its African American employment through the use of racial quotas in hiring and promotion. There was a time when racial quotas was not a dirty word, as you can see. The Sherrods, who had established New Communities Incorporated, an African American communal farm in Lee County in 1969, joined other black farmers in 1999 in suing the Federal Department of Agriculture for racial discrimination in farm home administration loan approvals for African Americans. In 2009, a federal court awarded New Communities Incorporated $12 million, which the Sherrods used to buy a former slave labor camp, Cypress Pond Plantation. In 2013, New Communities finalized a master plan to use the plantation as a conference center and a farm for racial healing and economic opportunity for farmers. The fight against racial discrimination continued through the last third of the 20th century and into the new millennium. When we look at the long 200-year freedom struggle in southwest Georgia, we acknowledge that the 10-month involvement of Martin Luther King in 1961-62 was important, perhaps its apex, but we must be careful not to distort its significance by forgetting that it was part of a much bigger, centuries-long engagement that is still ongoing in southwest Georgia. Thank you.
Dr. Formwalt, I read someplace, I don't know whether it's true or not, that there was a connection between Andy Young and Chief Pritchett and his movement from Albany to High Point, North Carolina. I think, is that accurate? You know.
Andy Young.
Yes.
That's news to me.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
How has your book done? How has it been received?
You might want to talk to some of the people who've read the book. The impact I'm getting, which may be distorted, is
Good.
positive. It's got lots of pictures.
Mr. Formwalt,
Yeah.
if you will, the research I've done say that there was a connection between James Gray and the Kennedys.
Yes.
And that he, in fact, got his friends to keep the federal government out of here between 61 and 62. Did you?
Yeah, Gray and Kennedy were political friends. There's photographs, for example, of Jack Kennedy when he was laying the foundation for his presidential campaign in the late 1950s. Here with James Gray at the Radiant Springs Country Club, which of course was officially and legally segregated. And yes, so Gray and others use their connections with the president to kind of hold off. But the president's patience only went so far. There's that famous August 1st, 1962 news conference where he states that he can't understand why, if the United States is sitting down with the Soviet Union in Geneva to talk, why the white leadership and black leadership of Albany can't sit down and talk in Albany. And of course the answer was given by the mayor, who said that he wasn't going to talk to anybody who comes from out of town. He was only going to talk with local leaders, not someone like Martin Luther King who goes around the country spreading racial rashes and all kinds of stuff like that.
Well, you hit on it very well in terms of moving into other counties, but people in Sumter County had to sing their freedom songs. The importance of the movement extended far beyond Southwest Georgia. There were lessons that were learned here that reciprocated all around the country, and I think that somehow we were able to let them turn that narrative around, and I'm wondering what's your take on that. Is it that people were not speaking out about it? How do you think that they were so able to successfully?
Well, speaking from a historian's perspective, the first histories, as I stated, were all told in terms of biography of Martin Luther King. That's where people first learned about Albany, is in terms of how King came. The community was so overwhelmingly racist that it was a defeat for King. And so Albany is a failure. It's the place where King failed. It's always in terms of Martin Luther King. And I think that story got implanted in Eyes on the Prize, which a lot of people saw on television. But importantly in the historical literature, in Taylor Branch's biography, Parting the Waters, and Bearing the Cross, the David Garrow biography, and even as recently as this volume 7 of the Martin Luther King Papers, which came out just this past fall, which is a great and marvelous document in terms of historical editing for Martin Luther King, but it reinforces the idea that Albany is a failure, because you don't. I thought it was interesting the date that they ended that volume on, August 31st, 1962. King was done with Albany.
I guess the follow-up would be, are you surprised at the lack of pushback by those who are actually actively involved as activists against that narrative?
Well,
did we allow that to happen, in other words?
I gotta say, it's from personally, when I first started talking about the Albany movement, I bought the traditional story that it was a failure. And the idea being that, not that blacks failed, but whites succeeded in defeating the movement. And I had people in town come up to me and suggest that I didn't know what I was talking about and so on. And I'm here today to say that those people were right. But interestingly enough, it took a white man who was not even alive, who hadn't been born yet at the time of the movement, to write about this young British historian, Michael Chalfin, to persuade me as a historian that what African Americans in town had been saying all along was right, that the movement was more than Martin Luther King and more than his failure, and that when you take this in the long perspective, which is what I tried to do in this book of mine, is to see this as a chapter, probably the most important chapter, but a chapter nonetheless, in a much longer freedom struggle that's been going on since we took the land from the Indians to exploit it and grow the cotton. And right up until the present. I didn't have, because of time limitations, I didn't have time to talk about a number of the 1970s and 1980s. The New Communities project itself was an amazing story. And it's a story that could be told in terms of failure or success, depending on when you cut off the story. You cut off the story in 1985, it's failure. You extend it to today, and what an amazing thing to take an old slave plantation and turn it into something that can be used to teach the history of civil rights and help African American farmers. Incredible story.
I want to disagree with the historian. King was not brought to Albany to start our movement. King was brought here for it to get in the news. That's why King came to Albany, to get in the news. We had a movement, and we still got a movement. The movement is not dead. It won't die until Jesus come back for the people. Because we still don't have our freedom because of people that's in charge won't give us our right for freedom. We didn't come over here in America to put America down. We came to build it. If you would look at all of the inventing that blacks did, they didn't bring crazy folks over here to America. It was smart people. And I don't think, if the historical will be fair, that King was brought here just to get the news out. He wasn't brought here. He just didn't. We didn't have the papers. We didn't have the magazines to print the news. It wasn't on television about our movement. The reporters that reported the news from the churches, they were sick and still is sick about the American movement. And you say who I am? I'm Juanita Harris Gardner. I was born in this segregated city. Went to a segregated school. Graduated from a segregated school. But look at me now. I am somebody because my daddy told me that I am somebody. And I am somebody today. And I want the news to stop saying that Albany Movement is a failure. We got a black mayor, the second one. Schools are integrated. I didn't say you trying to, I'm talking about the movement. I didn't say you're trying to cross up my words. I didn't say you. I said the historians over the years. I'm 85 years old, proud to be from America, proud to be from Albany. But I want the people to stop saying that the movement was a failure.
Because early on, we didn't like what you were writing. And I don't know whether you remember, even before there was a Civil Rights Institute, there was a group of us actually meeting to talk about starting a civil rights museum, as we were calling it. And one of the places was down on Joshua Street, where the Southwest Georgia Project has some land even today. And because of what you were writing, we stopped having the meetings and vowed to not share any of our information. I don't know whether you remember this, but Bob Mance, and there were a bunch of us who had lots of material, and a lot of that material never made it to this museum because even the true story of what happened is not documented correctly here. In fact, we brought a lot of those individuals who came to work here in Southwest Georgia back here in 2009 to help plan the 50th reunion. And they were very upset when they walked through this museum, this institute, to see that the story was not correctly told here. And some people got credit for things they didn't do, and credit, they gave some credit to some of those white students who were here that belonged to some of the black people who were in the movement. So this story, so that's why a lot of us still have lots of material that we have not shared, because the true story was never told by the people who were doing the writing. So that's why we have, when you heard me say this morning, we have plenty of stuff. Bob Mance, before he died, and Joanne is over there trying to get, she had some students in from a college in the north in the last couple of weeks, helping to organize some of that. But we have lots of material that we have not shared because we were not a part of putting the true story here in this institute.
One of you was going to get it. I mean, people get
I don't know that anybody's willing to get the true story here in this one. We may have to build another one. They didn't ask. They didn't ask the people who were really a part of it. When they dedicated the building down here in CB's name, and that's another thing that a point I wanted to make this morning. The people who name things, we have heroes in our communities too, but we are never consulted to see who it is that we look up to and we honor, and so that we can get things down there with their name on it. You had to go get a federal building. It had to happen from the federal level to get something with CB's name on it.
Right.
And when they had that dedication, people who were actually involved in the movement kept going up to my husband saying, Sherrod, it's all right. We know what you did. We know the real story. See, the story has been told by people who were not involved. It's cool now to say that you were a part of the movement. Right. It wasn't back then.
Right.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
I got to say that my appreciation for the charades changed tremendously as I researched this book. And I began to see a lot of things that have been lost because the story that's been told has been told from another perspective. And I just want to say that I appreciate what you guys have done and how you have literally, I mean, these guys, you want to take individuals that you can point to that characterize what the movement was all about from the 1960s to the present day, and they're sitting right there in that second row. So thank you. And I do hope that when I can put my historian hat on now and archivist hat on, that those materials don't ultimately get lost because they weren't preserved. I think this place or Albany State University are the logical places to think about as to where those things should be stored. If we can just build trust now with those institutions, and it's going to have to work on both sides, then future generations will be able to go to the primary sources and reinterpret the past as each generation should be doing.
And you should know that I sent Dr. Formwalt a message after I read the book and thanked him for telling the true story of what black life is like here in Albany and Southwest Georgia for black people.
Which was the best response I got from everyone that responded to me. It touched me the most. Thank you.
Let us thank Dr. Formwalt.